Good evening, everyone. It is presently Wednesday, January 13th, 2021 at 01:03 hours, or 1:03 a.m. for those of you who use a standard 12-hour clock. Tonight we shall be reading Unintended Consequences, a novel by John Ross. Part 2J, Growth Continued. For this recording session, we shall pick up at the start of Chapter 84, College Scouting Amherst, August 13th, 1969. This chapter corresponds to page 248 of the ebook edition and page 288 of the softcover print edition. Continuing now. Unintended Consequences, a novel by John Ross, Part 2J, Growth Continued. Chapter 84, College Scouting Amherst, August 13th, 1969. If you're looking for a department that will teach Marxism, I'd advise you to consider another school. Pardon me? Henry said. He thought he had heard the man correctly. But after listening to some of the economics professors at other liberal arts schools boast of the progressive courses their departments offered, he was startled by the man's blunt declaration. Henry Bowman was in the final stages of that ritual common to prep school students in the summer preceding their senior year, namely the college visiting trip. In late June, Henry had removed the rear seat and control stick from his clip-wing 140 horsepower Cub and bolted a cover over the hole in the floor where the stick had been. He had packed camping gear, clothes, a folding bike, his 5-inch barreled Smith & Wesson, and 3,000 rounds of ammunition behind the front seat before heading east. Henry had spent the last 3 weeks flying around New England, landing at local airports and bicycling to various schools. Most New England colleges had small airports nearby, and all had quoted him reasonable hangar rates if he decided to base his plane there during the school year. Lafleur Airport was only 4 miles from Amherst College, and the people there had been very hospitable. Airport owners tended to admire aerobatic pilots, particularly ones who camped out of their airplanes. This department teaches economics based on the principles of free market capitalism, and no one currently on our faculty advocates anything else. I want to make that absolutely clear. Professor Nelson was about 65, had white hair, and was slightly hard of hearing. His teeth were white and straight, and he showed a lot of them when he spoke. He was very outspoken, which Henry could plainly see, and he had no patience for the students who attempted to take over classes in the 5 colleges area of the Pioneer Valley. This had happened often the previous year, under the guise of so-called war protest. Professor Nelson had no quarrel with those who opposed the war. In fact, he was no fan of it himself. He had noticed, however, that all protest efforts took place during daytime hours of weekdays and disappeared on weekends and vacation days. It seemed crazy to the professor that a student who was paying thousands of dollars to attend college would barricade the door to a classroom and hold the class hostage to a free-form rap session about the war instead of demanding that the professor deliver every bit of his expensive expertise to the class. The only rational reason Nelson could accept was one he had overheard a demonstration leader tell another young man the previous spring. The hell with whether you believe this shit or not. This is the best way to get good-looking rich chicks to fuck you I've ever found. I mean, let me tell you. James Nelson was one of the longest tenured professors at Amherst College, and he was a nationally recognized expert on railroad regulation. As such, he was keenly aware of the problems created when policymakers attempted to unload their own socialist agendas onto dynamic, creative people powerfully motivated by economic self-interest. Professor Nelson smiled at Henry Bowman and added, "I tell you this now so you won't feel misled if you matriculate here a year from now. Maybe you'll want to reconsider your choice of colleges." Henry Bowman liked this man, even though he'd only known him for 20 minutes. He kinda reminds me of Elmer Keith, Henry thought. That is, if Elmer Keith had lived in an eastern college town, worn a suit, and taught economics for the last 40 years instead of living in Idaho, riding horses, guiding hunting parties, and shooting guns 2 or 3 hours a day. Oh, on the contrary, Henry continued, What you've said may make me want to tear up my applications to Hampshire, Antioch, and Williams, and bribe the dean of admissions here to make sure I get in." Nelson chuckled at this. Nobody who applied to Amherst College ever considered attending any of the 3 schools Henry had just named. "Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me," Henry said, becoming serious again. "I've read the descriptions in the course catalog of what this department offers, and there are a lot of classes I'd like to take here." "We do a fair job," Nelson replied. Henry stood to leave. "Can you aim me towards the geology building?" he asked. Nelson pointed with his cane out the window. "Corner of the quad, 200 yards. Make sure you go to the geology museum too. It's the small building right next to the science center." "Thanks, I'll do that." Henry left the man's office and found the stairwell. Nelson smiled to himself as Henry left. He liked young people in general, and the one he had just met was no exception. If anything, James Nelson had understated the Amherst College Economics Department's aversion to statist intervention in socialist economic policies. 8 years later, a student group devoted to campus humor and practical jokes would print up and distribute an official-looking notice of, quote, "recent additions to the spring course catalog," end quote. One of the entries would ostensibly be taught by the chairman of the economics department and was described thus: Econ 32. Constructive Alternatives to Capitalism. Professor Kohler. Required for major. Room 312, Converse Hall. 12 noon to 12:05, first Wednesday of every month. James Nelson would find this very amusing. It was the Geology Museum that did it. Henry Bowman reflected as he stretched out on the closed-cell foam mattress, pulled the sleeping bag loosely over his legs, and reflected on what he was sure was his final choice of school. He had entered the nondescript brick building and almost immediately been confronted with an absolutely immense mastodon skeleton that was mounted in the main room. He would come to learn that it was one of the largest in the world. After Henry had been staring at it for 15 or 20 minutes, a geology professor with a limp had struck up a conversation with him, and had invited Henry to a screening of a film entitled San Francisco, the City That Waits to Die. The professor was showing it for some summer interns from the State University 2 miles away, and offered to let Henry join them. Henry had been fascinated by the film, and impressed that he was included with the group and their entourage. Henry checked the mosquito netting in his tent and switched off the flashlight. It was at the edge of Quabbin Reservoir, about 20 miles north of the school, where he had spent 2 hours shooting after dinner until it got dark. A mile away was the Orange Sport Parachuting Center, opened in 1959 as the first such facility in the country. Henry had taken their first jump course that day at a cost of $65 US. It was his first airplane flight where the number of takeoffs had been greater than the number of landings. "This place is worlds better than what's in Boston," Henry thought as he lay in his tent. He relived the excitement of his first parachute jump, the exhilaration of the exit, followed by the quiet, peaceful experience under the canopy. Henry knew he would make many more parachute jumps in the future. Then he recalled the horrendous traffic that he had endured hitchhiking in Cambridge to get to what he had assumed was a tour for prospective students, only to wind up listening to a pompous nitwit explain at length about the Statue of the Three Lies. I could get to like this place. It's growing on me, Henry thought as he listened to the crickets and slowly drifted off to sleep. New chapter here. Chapter 85. Aeronautical Lecture, Guanxi and Market Reports. October 22nd, 1970. This chapter begins on page 250 of the ebook edition and page 291 of the softcover print edition. Continuing now. Chapter 85. Aeronautical Lecture, Guanxi and Market Reports. October 22nd, 1970. Can you hear me all right? The voice crackled over the radio. Henry Bowman looked around at his 3 passengers. All were nodding their heads. He picked up the microphone and squeezed the talk button. I'm reading you loud and clear, Professor Foos. This altitude suit you? He asked the man in the 6-passenger Piper a half-mile up ahead. It's good for now. It's a little bumpy this low, so if anyone starts feeling queasy, we'll have to go higher." "Sounds good to me," Henry replied. "We're all ears." Henry put the microphone back in the clip on the instrument panel and leaned out the mixture on the Cessna Skyhawk until the reading on the exhaust gas temperature gauge peaked. His altimeter read 2,500 feet, which was a little more than 2,200 feet above the ground. He was on a southern course, flying directly over the eastern edge of the Connecticut River, from Northampton, Massachusetts, to Long Island, New York. All right then. The first thing you'll notice is what we discussed in the lecture on Thursday. The river's path is almost never straight for very long, and you can see how it has grown more and more crooked over time. Serpentine is the official term, because of fluid dynamics. Henry dipped the right wing to give his passengers, particularly the one directly behind him, a better view of the river. Anything which disturbs the course speeds up the water at the outside of the curve. Look at the erosion on the outside of the bend in the river about a half-mile ahead, where the water is traveling fastest. Henry saw that the bank was undercut, and trees were about to topple into the river. Anne Ellis, in the front passenger seat, raised her Nikon camera for a photo. Up ahead you can see a place where the river curved so much that during the next flood, the water broke over the land and made an oxbow. Professor Foos continued over the radio. "Can you fly down a bit lower where I can get a better shot of the cut?" the young woman asked Henry. Anne Ellis was a geology major in her junior year at Smith College, taking a geology course at Amherst as part of the 5 colleges exchange program. The hydrodynamics class was on an aerial field trip to observe firsthand some textbook examples of maturing rivers and beachfront erosion. Anne Ellis had been somewhat startled when she had discovered that 3 of the students were going to be flown by a freshman who wouldn't even be eligible to take the course for another year. She had volunteered to be one of the 3 when she had overheard Henry telling Professor Foos that the visibility and photo opportunities would be much better out of the high-wing Cessna than the low-wing Piper that was being flown by a charter pilot. "Dropping down to 800 for some quick photos, Chuck," Henry announced over the radio as he reduced power slightly and dropped the nose of the Skyhawk into a fast descent. "Isn't this a little steep?" asked Mark Keller, a sophomore taking the course. "Only if it makes you feel sick," Henry said in a voice loud enough to be heard over the increased wind noise. "And it's calm today. If I cut back on power, they'll go farther ahead of us. That Piper's already throttled back so we can keep up, and the Geo Department's paying by the hour. You feel funny or anything?" he asked as he glanced over his shoulder. "Hell no," Keller answered, as if he'd been accused of something shameful. "Some people, it sneaks up on them, you know," Henry said mildly. He leveled the plane about 500 feet off the ground, and dipped the wing so Anne could get a clear shot of the undercut riverbank. "Perfect," she announced after she had clicked off 2 frames. Henry looked over his shoulder. The 2 men in the back seat were also taking photos. They lowered their cameras and nodded that they had both gotten their pictures. Henry added power and raised the nose slightly to return to his previous altitude. "We're dropping down to 2,000, the other pilot announced on the radio. "Meet you there," Henry radioed back. He saw with satisfaction that his separation from the lead plane appeared practically unchanged. It was an hour and a half to Long Island, and by the time the planes flew over the strip of land, Professor Foos had given the class a full narration of many of the things they had only read about before. The lead plane had alternated between 2,000 and 5,000 feet 4 times, temporarily sacrificing optimum viewing because of upset stomachs. Henry had dutifully followed the Piper's climbs and descents, and his 3 passengers made cracks about what lightweights Foos was stuck with in the other plane. Anne Ellis, Mark Keller, and Garrett Edison were all very comfortable with Henry's flying by the time Long Island appeared. As they passed over the far tip of the island, Foos's voice came over the radio once again. "We are going to speed up and climb to 5,000 on the way back, to save the Geo Department a little rental time." "It okay if we take our time getting back?" Henry radioed to the other plane. "I want to make sure everyone here gets all the good pictures they want." "That's fine with me, Henry," Foos replied. "Any requests?" Henry said, looking around at all 3 of his passengers. He put the 172 in a gentle turn out over the Atlantic Ocean. "Can we get down closer to the beach?" Ann Ellis asked. "Closer than we were over the river when we got down low, I mean." "Yeah," Garrett Edison agreed. How low can you go? Can you get in trouble for that?" "The law says minimum 500 feet from any person or structure in sparsely populated areas, which this edge is. If I stay a little bit out from the bank, I can get as close to the water as you want. Nobody has a tape measure around here. Long as we don't make anybody think we're about to hit 'em, we're fine." He thought for a moment. "Seems to me you'd want a little altitude for pictures, though." The Skyhawk was a mile out over the ocean, and Henry had it almost all the way turned around towards land again. "We'd like to get pictures of the different cuts in the coastline around the jetties," Ann Ellis said quickly. "I also think it would be fun to fly close to the land, don't you?" "You got it." Henry pushed the mixture control to full rich and pulled back the power a bit. He adjusted the trim and put the plane in a 135-knot dive. "I'm not trying to scare you," he explained. "Down low, if you have an engine problem, like it stops running," he added mentally, "you can trade airspeed for altitude and give yourself more choices of where to land. I don't ever fly low and slow unless I've got a good place to put down right in front of me." He leveled the plane at what he judged was about 20 feet off the water and 50 yards from the shore. "Man, you really see your speed down here," Mark Keller said. "Just how fast are we going?" "About 150 miles per hour, Henry replied. The three passengers busied themselves taking photos as the beach raced by. As they neared the end of Long Island, Henry gave the 150 horsepower Lycoming engine full throttle and eased back on the yoke. Soon they had 2,000 feet of altitude again. As they made their way north over Connecticut, Ann Ellis mentioned that her family lived in a suburb of Hartford. "You want to get an aerial photo of your house?" "Oh, yes, please." "Things look a lot different from the air. A whole new set of reference points. Let's figure out where the house is first." They spent several minutes analyzing major roads before homing in on Ann's neighborhood. The young woman used half a roll of film shooting photos of the property. Henry grinned at how excited she became. "Have you ever had an engine failure?" Mark Keller asked when they were back on course to Northampton. "I've never had an actual malfunction," Henry explained. "But my dad taught me to fly, and he was a big believer in emergency preparation. He'd switch the ignition off and pull the key when we were out flying, and tell me to make a real engine-out emergency landing. First few times he had to take it away from me and put it down himself, to show it could always be done. He wouldn't restart the engine until we were on the ground. I got to where I was pretty good at always knowing where the wind's coming from and always noticing spots I could put down, just out of habit. So I must have made 30 or 40 engine-out landings on bean fields and country roads over the years. Put down on a golf course once, too." "Isn't that illegal?" Ann Ellis asked. "Not very," Henry said with a shrug. "We never heard anything. And the few times anyone was around, they thought a biplane was so neat they didn't care where we'd landed." "You learned to fly a biplane?" "That's right. A steerman my dad used to teach aerobatics to Navy pilots in during World War II. Do you do aerobatics?" Ann Ellis looked at the other two passengers. "Can you show us something?" Mark and Garrett were about to protest, but Henry shook his head and spoke before they could. "Not in this aircraft. It's not approved for it. Now, I could do a barrel roll and it wouldn't overstress anything, but an inverted maneuver is the kind of thing people can see and catch on camera, and you can lose your license for that. Not like flying a little too close to an empty beach shack where no one can measure your exact distance, or putting down in a field where you can claim you lost power. Liabilities and all that. You see, flying's not like driving, where every state has its own rules and they're all pretty reasonable. The FAA, that's the Federal Aviation Administration, they run everything. And those federal guys can be a bunch of bastards, let me tell you. There's a lot more federal and administration in the Federal Aviation Administration than there is aviation. That's why there's almost no new designs coming out of the factories these days. Too expensive to jump through all the government's hoops. We're sitting in a 2-year-old airplane that's no more advanced than some of the stuff you could buy in the 1930s. That engine there, he said, pointing towards the nose of the plane, is essentially an oversized version of the 1939 predecessor to the Volkswagen. This old Lycoming is Stone Age compared to a Chevrolet V8 you could buy new in the crate from GM for $700. Henry stopped lecturing and thought for a few moments. There is one precise maneuver I can show you that doesn't look like anything from the outside. Just a climb and a dive. From inside the plane, it's pretty interesting, though. It's how they train the astronauts. He nodded and came to a decision. Alright, strap in. Hold your camera about even with your chin. You're gonna like this, he said to Anne Ellis. Like this? She asked. Point the lens straight forward, a little higher so Matt and Garrett can see it. Yeah, that's it. When I say now, let go of it, and start counting to 10 in a loud voice. At about a 1-second pace, okay? Anne Ellis looked dubious, but nodded. Her Nikon was on a wide strap around her neck. Watch your camera, guys, Henry said to the pair in the back seat. Henry gave the Cessna full throttle and lowered the nose until the airspeed needle was almost at the far end of the yellow arc, and scanned the air ahead and above him for any sign of other traffic. He leveled the aircraft with the needle touching the end of the yellow and then pulled it up into a fairly steep climb. Anne Ellis felt her body press into the seat with 3 times its normal weight. Ready? Now, Henry commanded as he eased the yoke forward. Anne Ellis let go of her camera just as the pressure vanished and she felt herself levitate an inch off the seat cushion. The Nikon floated in front of her face, hovering magically in the air. She was so astonished at this spectacle that she completely forgot to count to 10. Henry Bowman kept track of the airspeed needle with his peripheral vision as he looked at the floating camera and continued to apply precise pressure on the yoke of the aircraft while easing back on the throttle. When the needle was a half-inch from the end of the yellow arc, he yelled, "Grab it!" yanked the power back to idle, and eased back on the yoke to bring the Skyhawk out of the dive. Man, what was that? Gary Edison yelled when the wind noise had subsided. Henry took a deep breath. When we were in the climb and Anne let go of her camera, from the reference point of the ground, the camera behaved as if it were a projectile launched at an upward angle in a vacuum. The upward angle was the angle of our climb at the instant I pushed the yoke forward, and the camera acted as if it was in a vacuum because the plane is a closed compartment, and the camera doesn't feel wind resistance any more than our faces do. With me so far? Yeah. The camera keeps moving forward at a constant speed relative to the ground, and that constant speed is the same as the forward component of the plane's speed at the instant Anne let go of the camera. You got that? Yeah. Okay. Now, because of gravity, as soon as Anne lets go of it, this camera instantly starts accelerating towards the ground at a rate equal to that of the force of gravity, about 32 feet per second. Right? Yeah, right. Edison was starting to see where this was going. What I just did was fly the plane on the exact ballistic path of the camera. The trick is to arc the plane over at just the right rate so that the camera doesn't move inside the plane. Too big an arc and it would have fallen in her lap. Too tight and the camera would have bounced off the headliner. When you make an object float like that, you achieve perfect zero-G conditions. For about 8 seconds there, we were all absolutely weightless. As I guess you noticed. Yeah, no shit, Anne Ellis said meaningfully. Henry was momentarily embarrassed. That's how they train the astronauts for weightlessness, he explained. They use a stripped Boeing 707 with padding all over the inside, and since it's a lot faster, they get a lot bigger arc. I think they can get around 30 seconds of zero-G conditions in a 707. They also do it over and over again, and the astronauts have nicknamed that particular plane the Vomit Comet. He shrugged. It's one of the more difficult precision maneuvers, and it's not too hard on the equipment. Doesn't look like much from the ground, though, he added. My dad could do that same trick while he made the plane do a barrel roll. That really looked weird. The camera, or whatever, would look like it was rotating all by itself while it floated in front of your face. He shook his head. I'm not nearly that good. Anne Ellis said nothing. Obviously underwhelmed, Henry thought to himself. That's okay. She had fun when we blasted down the beach. In reality, Anne Ellis was silent for a very different reason. The few moments of 3G pressure, followed immediately by 8 seconds of weightlessness, had had a very interesting effect on her insides. She felt as if she were on the verge of orgasm. "Do you always have that kind of control?" she asked under her breath. Henry glanced over, thinking the girl had said something. Guess I imagined it, he decided. Henry Bowman spent the next hour putting the plane in perfect picture-taking position over various points of geological interest. His passengers relayed to him some of the things Professor Foos had explained in class, but not in the air. Henry Bowman entered the traffic pattern at 1,500 feet over Lafleur Airport in Northampton, Massachusetts. He glanced at his gauges, pulled his mixture control to full lean, and pulled the key out of the ignition. His 3 passengers watched in horror as the propeller in front of them stopped spinning and came to a halt. There was still wind noise, but the geology students had grown used to the sound of the engine. To them, the airplane now seemed as quiet as death. "I'm gonna go in to land, turn off the runway, and taxi into the spot next to the black and yellow clipped-wing Cub with the big tires down there," Henry announced. It was an old stunt that Dwayne Cole had made his trademark at the end of almost every one of his airshow routines. Henry turned onto base leg earlier than usual as he was descending faster than normal, flared cleanly, and greased the Skyhawk into the asphalt a third of the way down the runway. As his forward momentum declined, he turned off onto the taxiway at midfield, steered over towards the tie-down spot, and braked to a halt on the center line. Matt and Garrett were impressed, and thanked Henry sincerely. "Glad to do it, particularly since the department pays to rent the plane." He squinted and grinned, "And I think today has convinced me to major in geology, as well as economics." "Best school for it, if I say so myself," Matt asserted. Garrett concurred. Ann Ellis had also made a decision, one that concerned Henry Bowman's plans for that evening. It was going to make her roommate very upset, but she decided she didn't care. Later. "Hi, I'm Dick Gaines. Mind if I sit here?" "Hey, it's a free country, man. Do as you like," one of the 6 students at the lunch table said. Great. Listen, I wouldn't take up your time, but I'm running for class president, and I'd like your vote," Gaines said as soon as he had put down his tray. "President?" a young man with short black hair and acne said. "You're not even in our fraternity, are you?" "I know, I've seen you before." "Class president, Artie, not frat president, come on," one of the others corrected as he turned towards Dick Gaines. "Don't mind him, he got in here on an athletic scholarship," the young man explained. "Hey, fuck you, asshole, I heard him wrong is all. Artie's just pissed off he didn't get laid at Stevens last week. He's been jacking off in the shower so much every time it rains he gets a hard-on." The whole table laughed. Richard joined in nervously. "Ah, hell, the freshman class hasn't had much of a voice in student government, and I'd like to change that," Richard said when the laughter had died down. "Taylor here's got a voice. Should have heard him in algebra class yesterday. 7 can answer that. Probably only time he ever paid attention. Thought the teacher was going to drop his chalk. Well, I guess that must have been funny. I never could figure out algebra myself," Richard admitted. "You guys ready to shoot some hoops?" one of the boys asked. "Sounds good to me," another answered, and all 6 of them got up to bust their trays and leave the dining room. "Hey, remember, Dick Gaines for class president, aight?" Richard said to their departing backs. "Damn, I blew that one," he thought angrily. "They probably won't even bother to vote." Richard Gaines was only partially right. It was true that student elections were not taken very seriously, particularly at state universities in Missouri. It was also true that several people at the table would not remember his name an hour later. In the election that would be held just before Thanksgiving break, 5 of the 6 classmates he had met that evening would indeed have more important things to do, and would not bother to vote. The 6th would happen to be near the school's post office where the balloting was being done, and would cast his vote for the only name he vaguely recognized. With about 18% of the class voting, Richard's efforts at meeting every one of his classmates at the university would pay off. He would win the election with a solid 4% of his class supporting him. His victory would not have been possible if those people had not known his name. Later, "Hey, Hines, Do you remember our conversation on the Econ 11 assignment of analyzing a local business? The tenured professor asked. The Amherst College Economics Department chairman looked up from his book to glance at the man who had just entered the faculty lounge and called his name. Remember you were saying all the papers on Massachusetts pizza delivery services were putting you to sleep? Yeah, what about it? Take a look at this one. The chairman took the proffered paper from his associate, readjusted his glasses, and read the title page aloud. The Economics of the Smith & Wesson 44 Magnum Revolver, and the Pricing Strategy of its Manufacturer. He looked over the tops of his glasses. Another butter advocate? He asked. Just read it, Nicholson said with a smile. Take you 2 minutes. Department Chairman Kohler was known by his colleagues in the department for his ability to digest the printed word. He folded back the title page and scanned the paper. The only double-action revolver chambered for this cartridge. Kohler quoted. Says here the Springfield plant's too small for current military demand, and all Smith & Wesson's commercial guns are now back-ordered. But it goes on to say that long before the Vietnam War was a factor, this model was hard to find and, in fact, has always been a rarity that commands a price in excess of retail. He scanned a bit further, then read, although the factory has always honored their listed price on all guns, dealers regularly charge and get a substantial premium for this model, particularly in the longer barrel lengths. Kohler lowered the paper and laughed. Well, that just means the CFO flunked Econ 11 and the factory is incorrectly pricing their product. Keep reading. The factory's setting of the Model 29's price below the intersection point of the supply and demand curves would initially lead one to assume that the company's chief financial officer was not doing his job, Kohler quoted, and that he should therefore be fired. He editorialized with a laugh. But there is an alternative explanation that bears consideration. Kohler looked up at his associate. I can't wait to hear this one. This ought to be good, he said and continued to read. It is possible the decision-makers at the firm believe that rarity adds to this model's appeal, and, by extension, the desirability of the entire Smith & Wesson line. From my own experience, however, I believe there is an alternative explanation. The models 29, 27, and 57 are made in a limited production assembly facility involving large amounts of hand fitting. These arms exhibit a quality of fit and finish even greater than that of the rest of the company's production line. By actual test, these premier models also shoot more accurately than Smith & Wesson's other offerings. I believe it is impossible to significantly increase production rates of the 44 Magnum using existing production methods and facilities. Prices from the factory, currently set at $165 US on this low-volume model, are kept below market equilibrium levels, likely because of fears of the substantial loss of goodwill should it be perceived by customers that Smith & Wesson has suddenly started gouging them. Accordingly, and in light of the fact that Smith & Wesson is no longer family-owned, but is rather a part of the South American conglomerate Bangor Punta. Dare I detect a hint of U.S. pride here? Kohler interjected. I see 4 possible changes in the production and pricing of this arm. Kohler lowered his voice and read the 4 suggestions. 1. A slight reduction in standards of overall quality. 2. Construction of new plant and facilities for increased production of all models. 3. Design changes to the weapons themselves, specifically the elimination of minor features in order to lower unit production costs. 4. Substantial price increases at the factory level. And listen to this. Bangor Punta has already implemented number 1, and has started on number 2. I believe 3 will follow. The 4th change, a sudden jump in factory prices, is, in my opinion, unlikely to occur. The first 3 courses of action are less obvious to the public, and the present demands of war production will not last forever. Kohler read on silently, then looked up. So, The sleazy South Americans have lowered the quality of recent 44 Magnums, eh? But according to your author, there are enough older guns around to satisfy the people who shoot. And here he had to refer to the text. Over 10,000 rounds per year, or who regularly engage targets over 150 yards away. Interesting source. He continued to scan the paper. Now here's some good advice for us if we decide that's what we want to do next semester. Your Mr. Bowman says we should look for one with a serial number below 8,300,000. Well, that's certainly good to know, wouldn't you say? Not exactly local pepperoni costs have risen lately, lowering profit margins, now is it? Give this guy an A, Kohler said as he handed back the paper. I already did. Good. Later, the first thing I have to tell you, Anne Ellis explained, is that my roommate is going to be very upset if she finds us here together. Uh-huh. What about the house mother? Henry asked. She's kind of like the FAA, Anne replied with a laugh. We don't want to do anything obvious that she can actually see, like, say, running naked down the hallway. You know, we'll keep the door locked. Okay, Henry said. At that moment, he didn't trust his voice with anything over 2 syllables. Seriously, if Rachel arrives, she may go a little crazy. Anne looked pointedly at her guest. Henry shrugged. Okay, he repeated agreeably. Do you understand what I'm saying? Anne Ellis demanded. Suddenly, Henry understood exactly what Anne Ellis was saying, and he started laughing. I'm glad to be a substitute, but I really don't want to get shot, he said after a moment. Although, it might be worth it, he added mentally. Anne Ellis flushed scarlet. Don't think of it like that, she said quickly. And getting shot? My word, no, she just throws tantrums. Is that why there isn't anything breakable in here? Henry asked with a grin. Anne Ellis was startled. She looked around the small dorm room in Northrop House and realized there wasn't anything fragile in it. You don't miss anything, do you? She muttered, then turned towards Henry Bowman with a wicked smile. Let's see if you think this piece of equipment's obsolete, Anne said as she moved closer to her guest. Henry Bowman would later reflect that shooting, skiing, and flying had been the 3 things he had experienced in his life that had actually turned out to be much better than he had expected. That evening, he discovered a 4th. Good on you, Bowman. Good on you. New chapter here. Beginning here on page 299 of the softcover print edition and page 257 of the ebook edition, we have Chapter 86, Birthday, March 14th, 1971. This chapter segment corresponds to page 299 of the softcover print edition and page 257 of the ebook edition. Beginning now. Hey, Boon, phone for you. Says it's the hospital. The bartender held out the telephone receiver. A heavy, sour-looking man looked up from the pool table. He wore blue cotton twill work pants and a stained t-shirt that was stretched taut over his substantial belly. An unfiltered cigarette dangled from the corner of his mouth. He made no move towards the bar. Lady says your wife's in labor. Says you need to get down there. Tell her I'll be there in a bit. Labor always takes her a good long while. Boon Caswell gave the bartender a look that conveyed the fact that there would be no further discussion of the matter. The bartender spoke quickly into the phone and then hung up. Caswell went back to his pool game. Later, congratulations, Boon. You're a father again. The doctor smiled at the big man with an enthusiasm he did not feel. He did not like Boon Caswell. He did not know anyone in the town of Rolla, Missouri, who did, for that matter. Too many people had noticed the regular appearance of bruises on Moira, Boone's timid wife. There were some which had not quite faded even when she came to the delivery room. Boy or girl? The man demanded. You have a beautiful, healthy 7-pound, 2-ounce daughter, Boone, and Moira's doing well, too. Both your other daughters are in with Moira and the baby. Would you like to see them? He started to usher the man into the other room, but Caswell turned on his heel. Maybe when they get home, he said with his back to the doctor as he headed out the door. New chapter here. Beginning on page 300 of the softcover print edition and page 258 of the ebook edition, we have Chapter 87, The Raid, June 7th, 1971. Beginning now. Anybody here want to go on a couple raids? I got 2 coming in the same building. Could use some extra muscle. Lou Ciamillo looked up at the man who asked the question. Federal. Narcotics, maybe. Assholes sometimes, but hell, a raid's a raid. He glanced around the room. Just sitting on my ass here, he thought to himself. Wish I had my 357, though. Yeah, I'll go along. I got my PPK with me, but that's all. The Fed waved his hand in a dismissive gesture at Lou's statement. Oh, don't you worry about that. The federal agent stared at Ciamillo, who looked like someone you'd call in if you had a very heavy object that you needed lifted or moved, then nodded. We can use you on the ram. He looked around the room. Anybody else? Any takers? Several of the other off-duty officers hanging around the Montgomery County Police Station also volunteered to join in on the raid. What time we going in? One of them asked. We'll be leaving in a few minutes. Probably hit the first one 9:30 or so, the Fed replied. Ciamillo nodded. He was about to ask for more details about the raid when he heard another Montgomery County officer call his name. Hey, Lou, I've been meaning to ask you about this 45 of mine. Take a look at it, will you? I can't hit shit with it. Ciamillo laughed. Because he liked shooting and practiced a lot, he was a good shot and very knowledgeable about handguns. Other officers often came to him with gun questions or gunsmithing problems. Have you considered that the problem may not be the gun, Jimmy? Fuck you two. No, really, look at this. Is this too much slop in the barrel bushing, or are they all like that? The policeman pulled the slide partway back to show Lou that the gun was empty, then let it snap forward. He demonstrated how he could wiggle the end of the barrel with the tip of his finger. Ciamillo glanced over his shoulder at the Fed, who was now talking to someone else. I doubt they need this much backup, he thought when he saw the number of officers, then mentally shrugged. Might get in on some excitement. Sure has been a boring-ass week around here. He turned back to the problem of the inaccurate 45. Lou Ciamillo never did get around to asking what the raid was about. Later, the 4 men nearest the door could hear the sound of a television set inside the apartment. Most of the other 22 police agents were too far away to hear it. So Agent William Seals, who was leading the raid, made hand motions to them. He let the men know that the apartment was occupied and that they should remain silent. Okay, on 3, gentlemen, Seals whispered. 1, 2, 3. Ciamillo and the other 3 men put all their strength behind the battering ram, and the apartment door frames splintered and gave way. Lou Ciamillo was the second officer in the room. His adrenaline level was up, as it always was on a raid, and his senses felt unusually keen. His hand grabbed the butt of his Walther PPK as other officers and agents poured into the room. Lou was drawing the weapon in a practiced motion when his brain registered that the only occupants of the room other than the raiding party were a young girl of 10 or 12 who was sitting on a couch and the much younger child she was holding on her lap. The girl looked terrified, and the small child, frightened by the noise and sensing the older girl's fear, started to cry. Ciamillo kept his Walther pointed at the floor as he scanned the room. It soon became apparent that the girl, who they would later learn was only 10 years old, was babysitting that evening, and no one else was in the apartment. After a quick examination to confirm that the apartment was indeed empty, the lead agent scribbled a note on a piece of paper and thrust it at the child. "Give this to your parents when they get home," he commanded. "Hope we have better luck at the next one. Let's go," Seals muttered as he led his comrades out of the apartment, through the shattered doorway. The girl held the paper without looking at it and stared at the strange, disheveled men leaving through the shattered doorway. She had no idea who they were, or what they had come for. This was understandable, as not a single one of the men who had crowded into the efficiency apartment was wearing a police uniform or had ever mentioned that he was a police officer. Lou Ciamillo was starting to get a very bad feeling about this whole thing. Several minutes later, 27-year-old Kenyon Bello was taking a bath. He would have preferred a shower, as it was a chore for a grown man to wash and rinse himself in a cramped tub. The shower head still wasn't fixed, though, so a bath it was. It wasn't the difficulty Ken minded that night, however, but rather the fact that it took more time. This was relevant because as soon as Ken Ballo finished his bath, he was going to get laid. His wife Sarah Louise had made that abundantly clear 10 minutes earlier. Her exact words had been, "If you aren't out of that tub, dried off, and in bed with me in 15 minutes, big boy, I'm gonna have to start without you. Remember the Boy Scouts motto, be prepared." Sarah Louise was joking about the fact that her husband, a pressman for the Washington Post newspaper, was also a scout troop leader. Newspaper articles would later mention this fact as a point of interest. Ballo finished rinsing himself, flipped the tub drain to open, and was about to stand up when he heard muffled noises outside the apartment. "Federal officers with a search warrant," Agent Seals announced in a normal speaking voice, making no move to knock on the door. Lou Ciamillo shot him a look, and the Fed glared at the local cop as if to say, "You gonna make something of it, asshole?" The man did not like being second-guessed about law enforcement procedures by a line officer in a county department. "Ken, dear, I think there's somebody at our door," a nude Sarah Louise Bello shouted to her husband. "And I don't have any clothes on," she added unnecessarily. She glanced at her wrist, realized her watch was lying on the dresser across the room, and scowled. Neither she nor her husband were expecting anyone, and the hour was late. "Open the door. Federal agents," the agent leading the raid said. His voice was a little louder this time. "I'll get it," the husband shouted back to his wife. Ken Ballo thought he had heard someone say something that sounded like, "Open the door," but the rest hadn't been clear. He stepped out of the tub and wrapped a towel around his waist. He intended to send whoever it was on his way post-haste. "You catch that?" one of the officers asked. The others, including Lou Ciamillo, shook their heads. "There's 2 of them. I heard that much," the lead agent stated. The second one was a man's voice. "That's good enough for me." Lou Ciamillo had been about to say that if he and the agents couldn't understand what the people in the apartment were saying, it was logical to assume that the occupants had not understood the Treasury agent's command either. But Seals was already barking more orders. "All right, let's bust this door open before they have a chance to get out the back or get rid of the evidence." "We got over 20 guys here," Lou thought. "Why aren't any of them around the back already?" He shrugged inwardly. "Mine not the reason why," Ciamillo thought as he prepared to use the ram. "Must be a narco raid." He couldn't think of any contraband other than narcotics that could be disposed of on a moment's notice inside of an apartment. "All right, 1, 2, 3. The battering ram crashed into the wood. But unlike the door in the previous raid, this one held. Ken Ballo had installed a door that was reinforced with steel. The door frame cracked, but did not give way. "Again," Agent Seals commanded. Ken and Sarah Louise, who were in separate rooms of the apartment, both heard the tremendous crash at their door and realized that they were under attack. Ken Ballo ran from the room, pulled open his desk drawer, and grabbed a percussion revolver made in 1847. Sarah Louise had put on her bikini panties and was about to reach for her bra when the first impact hit the entrance to the apartment. She immediately leapt out of bed and started towards the bedroom door. Dressed or not, she was going to help her husband fight off whoever or whatever was invading their home. Some people, particularly those with little interest in firearms, would later puzzle over the oddity that a man who felt he needed a weapon for home defense would choose a 120-year-old cap-and-ball black powder revolver for the purpose. They would correctly point out that even a 100-year-old revolver would have been a far better choice, as 1870 was the period when cartridge weapons came into common use and replaced guns that used loose powder, round balls, and percussion caps. Ken Balu had a loaded cap and ball antique instead of a 20th century Colt or Smith & Wesson for a very simple reason. He did not at that moment own a more modern handgun. Ken Balu, the Washington Post pressman and part-time Boy Scout troop leader, did own a modern shotgun for bird hunting. He was primarily a collector of antique firearms, however, and he had a fine collection of 1840s-era cap-and-ball revolvers in addition to the one in his hand. The Balus lived in a middle-class, integrated apartment building. There had been a burglary or two in the area, but violent crime was not a major concern for most residents of Silver Spring, Maryland. In fact, Ken Balu had not kept any loaded firearm available for protection when he had been single, for he had viewed risks from criminals as minimal. It was only under the contract of marriage that he had recognized his obligation to guarantee another person's safety. He had thought of buying a Smith & Wesson, but monthly bills and other financial concerns had delayed that event. That was the reason that when the 27-year-old scout leader ran naked and dripping wet towards his living room, prepared to protect his wife from whoever was breaking into their apartment, he was carrying a gun that had been made approximately 50 years before the first airplane, 30 years before the first telephone, 18 years before the abolition of slavery, and 2 years before the birth of his own great-great-great-grandfather. As soon as the door crashed open and the plainclothes raiding party poured into the Balus' living room, Lou Ciamillo had his Walther PPK in his hand. His arms were extended and his pistol was pointed at the entrance to the narrow hallway that led to the rest of the apartment. Ken Balu came running down the hallway, and Ciamillo put the front sight of the PPK on his head, but he held his fire until he saw the man was armed. This was the reason that when Lou Ciamillo squeezed the trigger of his PPK, several shots had already been fired by other participants in the raid. Balu collapsed as shots continued to ring out in the apartment. The nude man's last act was to pull the trigger of his antique revolver, discharging the weapon at a distance of 10 inches into a bookcase nearby. Then his brain function shut down and he collapsed behind a partition in the hallway. Ciamillo watched Balu fall behind the partition, which was made of concrete blocks. It was a perfect let-off, he thought. I know I hit him. The deputy sheriff's adrenaline was pumping, but he held his fire as the federal agents continued to pour bullets at the man's body. The painful noise of the shots was still ringing in his ears when Lou realized that some of the sound was coming from a nearly nude woman who had run to the side of her fallen husband. She was screaming, and Ciamillo started to step towards her, but a federal agent rushed past him and pulled her away from her husband's shattered body. The agent immediately began to recite Sarah Louise's rights to her, but she was hysterical and obviously did not hear or understand a word of what was said. Balu's wife cringed in fear, and Ciamillo suddenly realized something that troubled him greatly. She doesn't know we're cops. Not a single one of us is in uniform. The agent who had read Sarah Louise her rights pulled cuffs out of his pocket, then shoved the woman out the door. Ciamillo turned away and stared at the inert form on the floor. One of the feds was giving the body a casual glance as he hurried into the other room. Lou Ciamillo took measured, even breaths. He felt his heart pounding in his chest and willed the organ to slow down. He looked around the modest apartment, trying to take it in as scruffy-looking federal officers and other plainclothes police agents swarmed through the small area. The feds were busy tearing the place apart, searching for evidence. Balu's wife, wearing only panties and handcuffs, was still screaming hysterically and trying to get back into the apartment to be with the body of her husband. "Pay dirt!" Ciamillo heard an agent yell from what he would later learn was Ken Balu's study. "Look what we got here!" He walked proudly towards his supervisor. The man was carrying several dummy hand grenades of the type that were sold at Army surplus and hardware stores, usually alongside the canteens, flashlights, and ammo cans. Lou knew what real hand grenades looked like. He and his father had set off dozens of live ones out in the country when he was a boy. He could instantly tell that these grenades were inert, however. As they had no detonators, their bases were drilled, and it was easy to see that they were empty. One of them was glued to a piece of wood and had a numbered tag hanging from its handle. Ciamillo watched as the agent ripped the wood from the grenade and tossed it aside. He stepped over and looked at the piece that the agent had discarded. The words, "Complaint Department, please take a number," were embossed on a plaque attached to the piece of stained pine. Ciamillo smiled, then quickly sobered as he watched the federal agents racing around the place, pulling out drawers and turning things over. One was coming down the hallway carrying a side-by-side 20-gauge shotgun. "Let's write this up, too," the man said, grinning and holding the $80 bird gun as if it were $1 million worth of stolen jewels. "I found these," another man announced. He was holding aloft a thin cardboard box about the size of a book of paper matches, yellow with blue and red printing on it. Ciamillo recognized it instantly as a box of Winchester primers for reloading shotgun shells, available for less than $1 at any gun or hardware store in the country. The bad feeling Lou Ciamillo had felt earlier came back with multiplied intensity. Just who are these assholes? Lou wondered, not for the first time that night. Why the fuck do they care about reloading supplies and flea market junk? Who's the guy we just killed? And what did they want him for? Lou Ciamillo was about to find out the answers to at least some of these questions. "Tax agents!" Lou Ciamillo demanded in an outraged whisper. The other Montgomery County police officer put his hand on his friend's arm and tried to reassure him. "We thought you knew, Lou." Ciamillo slapped the hand away. "Thought I knew? There were more than 20 of us. We just killed that guy, for Christ's sake." Ciamillo was apologetic. 24 armed men dressed like a bunch of biker trash and carrying a battering ram raid a guy's apartment and kill him, and now you're trying to tell me the feds leading the raid were just a bunch of pencil-pushing assholes from the ATF? Those guys are supposed to be checking paperwork, for Christ's sake. His mouth hung slack as he waited for a reply. When none came, he went on, his voice rising in the process. "What did they have on him, huh? Tell me that. What the fuck did they have on him?" They did say they found a 4-inch piece cut off a shotgun barrel," the police answered lamely. "And I'll bet it came off that little side-by-side 20-gauge I saw one of them assholes carrying. Barrels were at least 20 inches long. Looked more like 22 if you ask me. I'd bet my badge that gun's legal." Ciamillo stabbed his finger angrily at the other officer before continuing. "And even if the poor bastard had cut the thing down below 18, so what? So he's made an NFA weapon, and under the National Firearms Act of 1934, he owes the IRS $200 tax on it. You ever owe the IRS $200, Hal?" Take it easy, Lou." "Oh, fuck. Take it easy. Fuck taking it easy. You weren't one of the first guys in the door like I was, and you didn't pop a cap at that poor bastard because of them tax assholes. Now answer me this. Answer me this one question. You ever owe the IRS $200, huh? I sure as shit have. Think maybe the taxmen should start busting your door down when you and your wife are standing around naked and put a few slugs in you because they think maybe you owe them $200? Well, of course I've owed the IRS $200, his friend said soothingly. But those were ATF agents, Lou. They're a part of the IRS, but you and I both know they don't do income tax work. They're the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Right! Lou exploded. And they're a alcohol, tobacco, and firearms tax agency. They go around and make sure all the fucking tax seals are pasted on the goddamn whiskey bottles and cigarette packs. Do you honestly think it'd be fine if Agent fucking Neil rounded up some local cops to go bust in on the guy who owns the Camel Cigarette Company? Bust his door down with a battering ram and kill him coming out of the shower, on information from a reliable informant that he had cigarettes under his bed and he owed $200 in tax on them? His friend made no reply, but lowered his eyes, ashamed. Gotta be guns? Okay. How about the reliable informant tells him Strom Ruger hasn't paid the government its 11% excise tax on a batch of .357 Magnums? Think the ATF guys should go break into Bill Ruger's house in the middle of the night? Huh? He's probably pulled a gun or two out the back door of the plant for his own use, and they'd be ones made after the Civil War. Maybe 26 guys wouldn't be enough. Hell, maybe they should fuck breaking down the door and just bum him out. Ciamillo shook his head in disgust, then exploded in frustration. Jesus! I can't believe they ever let those stupid tax cocksuckers carry guns at all. He suddenly thought of something and his eyes narrowed. "Who's got the warrant? I want to see what's listed on the fucking search warrant. Come on!" Ciamillo was not yet aware of several things. First of all, Ciamillo did not know that the search warrant for Ballou's apartment was, for the most part, still blank. The time would be filled in as 2031, or 8:31 p.m., the last legal minute of daylight on June 7th, as the blank warrant had specified that the search had to be conducted during daylight hours. Items to be searched for would also soon be filled in, but not as short-barreled shotguns, for a measuring tape would reveal that the barrels of Ballou's gun were well over the 18-inch minimum. Instead, hand grenades would be written in the proper place on the warrant, in keeping with the nature of what was seized. Weeks later, the agency would be forced to admit that dummy grenades were not a registerable item on which tax was due. This admission would occur when a number of citizens around the country would produce proof that after the passage of the 1968 Gun Control Act, they had applied to the ATF to register inert grenades identical to Ballou's, and that their applications had been returned to them rejected, with a written statement that such items were not subject to registration and taxation by the federal government. Undaunted, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Division of the Internal Revenue Service would then, 3 weeks after the raid, retrieve the box of shotgun shell primers and some paper caps for a toy cap pistol from the police department's storage locker. They would produce these items as evidence that Ballou intended to make live grenades, without paying the tax on them, thus justifying their raid. The ATF agency would be forced to admit that a dummy grenade successfully jerry-rigged with a shotgun shell primer and some black powder would explode the instant the handle was released, not 5 seconds later, but the feds would insist that this minor fact was not relevant to their case in any way whatsoever. Second of all, Ciamillo did not know that Kenyon F. Ballou had not been killed in the raid. Ballou was, at that moment, in a coma, and hooked up to life support systems at the local hospital, and would remain attached to them until his condition stabilized. Thirdly, Ciamillo did not know that only one of the 9 bullets the raiders had fired had hit Ballou. When that single bullet had struck Ballou between the eyes, it had penetrated his brain and lodged in his cerebral cortex, instantly causing permanent paralysis and brain damage. Ballou had fallen behind the reinforced partition, and the concrete blocks had stopped the 4 additional shots the federal agents had fired at his unconscious body. Ken Ballou was not dead, merely paralyzed and brain damaged despite being shot between the eyes at 10 feet. And this was because the one bullet that had hit him was from a .380 automatic. The .380 Auto is a weak cartridge that was designed in 1908 for use in small pocket pistols for women. No police department in the entire United States of America issues .380 automatics as duty sidearms for its uniformed officers. But many officers carry a .380 of one make or another when off-duty because of the gun's small size. The last thing that Lou Ciamillo did not yet know, but would eventually learn, was that of the 26 IRS agents and local police officers participating in the disastrous raid on Ken Ballou's apartment, only one of them had been carrying a pistol chambered for the .380 automatic cartridge. Had Ballou been shot in the brain with a more powerful .38 or .357, he almost certainly would have been killed. Furthermore, no one would have ever been able to determine which man had fired the fatal shot, since all of the other shots fired that night had been one of the other of these 2 calibers. Such as it was, there was only one gun from which the slug now in Ken Ballou's brain could have been fired. This fact would be learned when Ballou's condition was such that doctors could finally extract the copper and lead projectile and give it to the police for examination. The bullet that left the Washington Post pressman, scout leader, and antique arms collector permanently paralyzed and brain damaged had been fired from a Walther PPK. And at that moment, that PPK was resting inside the waistband of Lou Ciamillo's pants. New chapter here. Here on page 264 of the ebook edition and page 307 of the softcover print edition, we have Chapter 88. Legally Proper, or Justifications for Tyranny. August 6th, 1971. Listen to this shit. Secretary of the Treasury John B. Connolly said that he had reviewed the investigative report and concluded that the actions of the law enforcement personnel in executing the search warrant for the Ballou apartment were legally proper under the circumstances. Bernie Sutter put the newspaper down and snorted in derision. Fuck. The fix is in. Henry Bowman glanced over at the man but said nothing. Bernie was the proprietor of the Sutter Sport Shop, a small, cluttered gun store in middle-class Overland, which was in North St. Louis County. Well, of course, said Thomas J. Fleming as he looked up from the 1887 Belgian service revolver he was examining. 26 armed men dressed in old clothes? That's the logical team to assemble when you know you're up against a shrewd adversary, he went on rapidly. Look, Ballou had a reinforced door, right? Maybe that's an indication he was committing crimes behind it, at least by the ATF's logic. He sent his wife into a separate part of the house. That was probably so that he could sucker the feds into a pinch or maneuver. They had all their clothes off. Obviously, this was to distract the officers. And the police know their own limitations. They know that their shooting skills are well below that of private citizens. They had to have 26 on their side to give themselves a fighting chance that someone would hit the man they were trying to kill. And as you can see, their strategy worked to perfection. They fired 9 shots at 10 feet, and just as they had hoped, one of them hit Ballou. The raid went perfectly. Not a single police agent was injured. Thomas J. Fleming was 2 years out of the University of Chicago School of Law. Slender, dark-haired, clean-shaven, of medium height, and wearing glasses, Tom Fleming was the proverbial man who could disappear in a crowd of one. That was true, however, only so long as Tom Fleming did not open his mouth. As soon as he started speaking, anyone listening could not avoid recognizing the tremendous store of energy the man possessed, nor were they likely to miss his biting wit. It would also be obvious that Fleming understood the Constitution better than most lawyers, and that he absolutely despised governmental infringements on his civil rights. There's only one real reason to become a lawyer, he had been known to say to close friends in private. That's so nobody can fuck with you. He returned his attention to the 19th century Belgian revolver. I wonder what the Treasury Department would consider acting improperly. Another regular, Stockley Meyer, threw out. Using a nuke. Maybe, Bernie said glumly. Sutler Sport Shop in North County was very different from Goodman's for Guns in downtown St. Louis. Whereas the Goodman brothers' clientele tended to be well-heeled owners of finely made arms, Bernie Sutter catered to middle-class patrons who were looking for military surplus rifles or second-hand Colts and Remingtons, and who spent a large fraction of their shooting dollars on ammunition. Stockley Meyer, Henry Bowman, and Max Collins were 3 of a small number of St. Louisians who regularly visited both stores. Since Henry had turned 16 2.5 years prior, he had become a regular visitor to the store, which was 12 miles from his house. A lot of high-volume shooters congregated there. Tom Fleming was one of these, and he had been patronizing Sutter's since the age of 8. His father, Thomas Albert T.A. Fleming, had died when the boy was 11. From then until he acquired his first car shortly before his 17th birthday, Tom Fleming had made the 8-mile trip to the gun shop on his bicycle. Fleming especially liked the fact that Bernie Sutter would put guns in layaway. Up until the law change in 1968, Sutter did this even for customers that weren't yet old enough to drive. He'd keep the customer's money clipped to a file card with the gun's description written on it in the store's safe until the full amount was attached. Most of Fleming's steadily growing collection had been acquired from Bernie in this fashion. Whereas Henry's favorite sporting arms were, in no particular order, long-range rifles, elephant guns, and .44 Magnum revolvers, Fleming gravitated towards military rifles and handguns, especially the .45 caliber automatic Colt 1911. Both young men liked machine guns. Although unlike Henry Bowman, Tom Fleming did not own any full-auto weapons on which the National Firearms Act branch of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had bestowed its governmental blessing. Furthermore, Fleming owned no cannons at all. When he had been in junior high school, long before the 1968 Gun Control Act reclassified military arms over .50 caliber as destructive devices, Fleming had studied the ads offering lattes for under $100. At that time, he had never figured out how to get the 8.5-foot, 110-pound weapon home from the freight depot on his bicycle. By the time he got a car, college was looming, and owning a latte was long forgotten. This guy Balu must have been doing some other stuff that isn't in the paper. Surely. Threw out a local skeet shooter who bought his shotgun shells at Bernie's. I can't believe our own government would do something like this, even by accident. I mean, come on, 26 agents? They'd never put that many cops on some guy's apartment if he really was just a collector of old cap and ball revolvers. We're not getting the whole story here. Are you nuts? Tom Fleming exclaimed. The Belgian revolver was forgotten as he turned to face the man. Haven't you read any history? Like maybe what happened in Germany in the 30s? Fleming was currently involved with a woman he had first met in college. She was slender, vivacious, and possessed of a remarkable sex drive. She was a Jewess, and one entire branch of her family had been executed in Buchenwald. This is the United States of America, the skeet shooter said with slight irritation. Which of course makes us immune to any violations of our civil rights, eh? Tom Fleming immediately replied with a voice that dripped sarcasm. Listen, he continued, his tone changing to one of exposition. For the last 100 years, cops have known it was okay to beat on people, and sometimes kill them, as long as they only beat on and killed colored guys. Then, starting a few years ago, cops learned they could beat on and kill not only colored guys, but also white guys as long as the white guys had long hair, ratty clothes, no jobs, and were out in public bitching about Vietnam. Now, in addition to colored guys and white guys that have long hair, ratty clothes, and no jobs who are out protesting in public, the cops have learned it's okay to beat and kill white guys with short hair, nice clothes, and good jobs inside their own homes. That is, if the white guy owns guns. Fleming took a deep breath and raised his index finger. He realized he was lecturing again, but it was a habit he had a very hard time resisting. The others in the shop were giving him their full attention. When they came for the trade unionists, I did not stand up, for I was not a trade unionist. When they came for the gypsies, I did not stand up, for I was not a gypsy. When they came for the Jews, well, you know the rest, he said, not wanting to take up more time with the lengthy quote. Finally, they came for the Lutheran minister, but there was no one left to stand up for him, and he ended up in a concentration camp because he didn't think his rights were in danger. The damn fool. Look, a bunch of stumblefuck cops hit the wrong apartment on a bad tip, the skeet shooter said in reply to Fleming's quote. That's a lot different than the military carrying out the direct orders of the chief executive, which is what happened in Germany. Maybe so, but we've done that here in America, too. All heads turned towards the young man who was standing by the display case holding a newspaper and a thick hardcover book. Henry Bowman met their gaze, and then the skeet shooter spoke up. That National Guard mess at the college was the same thing. A bunch of trigger-happy cops, not the army. For reference, they are referring here to the Kent State shooting in Ohio on May 4th, 1960. National Guard mess at the college in Ohio was the same thing. A bunch of trigger-happy cops, not the army. Interesting you should say that, Sid, Tom Fleming said. As a matter of fact, the National Guard is part of the standing army. They take their orders from the President of the United States, and they can in fact be sent into combat outside the country, which is why National Guard service qualifies as military service. Fleming smiled at Henry Bowman, but Henry shook his head. I didn't mean Kent State, Henry clarified. I was talking about General Douglas T. MacArthur, George S. Patton, and Dwight D. Eisenhower. Patton and Eisenhower were majors at the time. MacArthur sent the tanks in to drive American war veterans out of Washington. Then he led his troops to where 20,000 unarmed veterans were camped, and he burned them out. He set fire to their camp while they were still in it, and his soldiers shot veterans that resisted. The bonus army, Fleming said softly. Sid the skeet shooter was looking quizzically at both Tom Fleming and the young man that had told the bizarre story about General MacArthur. Henry saw his expression and spent the next 10 minutes explaining about the bonus marchers and what had happened to them. Everyone in the room was shocked, but not surprised. This Balu thing makes me think maybe we should all listen to Mr. Forsyth here, Henry said finally. He was holding up his copy of The Day of the Jackal, which had recently become a national bestseller. Been reading this for the last few days, and there's a detailed description of how to procure the birth certificate of someone who died as a child and create a new identity. Yeah, I heard about that, Tom Fleming said. You're right. Maybe we should all be out scouring small-town graveyards. Yeah. For a few moments, no one spoke. So how do you know so much about it? Sid asked finally. The bonus army, I mean. My great-uncle was one of them. MacArthur's soldiers broke his arm and he was badly burned in the fire. Infection set in and the doctor at a veterans hospital in Pennsylvania cut off his whole arm. But it was too late, and he died a couple of days later. The skeet shooter nodded, then looked around awkwardly. No one much felt like talking anymore. It was Fleming who finally broke the silence. Tom Fleming, he said, smiling, and extended his hand. I've seen you in here before, but I don't think we've met. Are you that guy Bernie's been telling me about who shoots clay birds with an elephant gun? Only when I get lucky, Henry replied with an embarrassed smile. I gotta talk to you about this, Fleming said quickly as he stepped over to the counter where Henry was standing. I've run a bunch of training courses for cops, and I'm having real trouble getting them to hit anything that's moving, even if it's 3 feet away and the size of a refrigerator. He began to use his hands to diagram the problem. Now, when you shoot stuff out of the air like that, say it's moving sideways, not away from you, is it better to... By the time their conversation ended 40 minutes later, Tom Fleming and Henry Bowman were good friends. They were also the only two there that day who would remember the short discussion about new identities. New chapter here. This concludes our recording session for Part 2J of Unintended Consequences by John Ross. We are presently at the start of Chapter 89, Violation, August 14th, 1971. The start of the following recording session corresponds to page 267 of the ebook edition and page 311 of the softcover print edition. It is presently Tuesday, March 9th, 2021 at 12:05 a.m. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful evening. Auf Wiedersehen.